Left alone at the airport, she boarded a private jet with a Mafia boss. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The digital display board at the international airport flickered with a rhythmic, mechanical click. The cold crimson text announcing the cancellation of the final flight to London like a final, unappealing verdict on her life. Heidi sat on a hard, molded plastic chair in the deserted terminal, her fingers white-knuckled around the handle of a carry-on bag that contained everything she had left in the world. A few changes of clothes, her architectural sketches, and a passport that felt more like a target than a document of identity. The silence of the airport at 3 a.m. was not a peaceful thing. It was a heavy, predatory weight that seemed to swallow the sound of her own breathing, leaving her alone with the echoing ghosts of thousands of travelers who had already found their way home. She was 27 years old, a woman who had spent her life navigating the quiet corners of architectural archives and finding solace in the geometric certainty of stone and steel. Yet here she was, a fugitive in a cavernous hall of glass and glass. Behind her, she could hear the rhythmic echo of heavy boots against the polished marble, a sound that had been stalking her since she left the train station in a frantic rush. She knew who they were, men sent by a father she hadn't seen in a decade, a man whose gambling debts had finally outpaced his ability to lie, leaving her as the only collateral remaining on his ledger. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, as she realized the security checkpoints were closing, and the lights in the main concourse were beginning to dim into a twilight of uncertainty. In the center of the terminal, surrounded by a vacuum of space that no one dared to enter, stood a man who looked like he owned the very air he breathed and the shadows that clung to the corners of the ceiling. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been carved onto his frame by a master sculptor, his presence so commanding that the neon signs of the closed boutiques seemed to dim in his presence. He was flanked by 4 men whose suits couldn't quite hide the lethal bulk of their shoulders, their eyes scanning the empty hall with the clinical detachment of wolves guarding a high-value kill. This was Silas Vane, a man whose name appeared in the financial columns of every major newspaper as a titan of global shipping and technology, yet whose real power was whispered about in the dark corners of the world, where laws were merely suggestions and blood was the only currency that never devalued. Heidi had seen his face on a magazine cover once while waiting for a bus in the rain, but the glossy paper had not captured the terrifying stillness of his eyes or the subtle, jagged scar that traced a line from his jaw toward his ear, a permanent reminder of a world that didn't allow for mistakes. He was checking a gold watch, his expression one of bored impatience, until his gaze shifted and locked onto hers with the precision of a predator finding its mark. The men in the gray coats were closing in now, 3 of them fanning out to block her exit toward the taxi stands, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats and the dimming light of the terminal. Heidi felt a cold sweat break out along her spine, her intellect frantically calculating the distance to the nearest open door, but the math was failing her in the face of such overwhelming odds. She looked back at the man in the charcoal suit, finding a different kind of danger in his steady, unblinking stare. It was the look of a man who saw through every mask, who understood the exact nature of the fear radiating from her, and who found it more interesting than the millions of dollars he was undoubtedly moving with a single phone call. When Silas Vane began to move toward her, his bodyguards shifting in a synchronized phalanx that suggested a level of training far beyond corporate security, the men in the gray coats hesitated. Their aggressive stride faltered at the sight of a predator far higher on the food chain, a man who didn't just break the rules but wrote them in the ink of his enemies. Silas stopped 3 feet from her, his shadow falling over her like a heavy velvet shroud, and she realized he was much taller than he had seemed from a distance, a mountain of controlled aggression and expensive cologne that smelled of cedar and old money. "I believe your flight has been delayed indefinitely, and the hospitality of this terminal is rapidly reaching its expiration date," Silas said, his voice a deep, resonant cello that vibrated in the air between them and seemed to anchor her to the spot. He did not look at the men who were now hovering at the edge of the light, their hands twitching toward their waistbands in a display of nervous bravado. He looked only at Heidi, his eyes a piercing, mercury gray that seemed to catalog her soul, and find the hidden strength she had tried so hard to bury. She realized in that moment that she had a choice between a slow, agonizing death at the hands of her father's creditors or a leap into a dark, unknown abyss with the man standing before her. She took a breath, her voice trembling but her eyes remaining sharp as she looked up at him, refusing to cower even as the world collapsed around her. "I do not think delay is the right word for it," she replied, her wit flashing through the terror like a blade of light in a storm. "I think I have been abandoned in a very expensive tomb, and the gravediggers are currently waiting for the lights to go out." Silas felt a ghost of a smile touch his lips, a movement so slight it was almost invisible, and he gestured toward the private terminal gates with a hand that was steady and scarred. "My jet leaves in 10 minutes for Zurich, and I find myself in need of a distraction from the crushing boredom of my own thoughts. You will come with me, not because I am a gentleman or because I have a penchant for rescue, but because those men behind you are remarkably poor at hiding their intentions, and I dislike seeing such untidy business in my presence. It offends my sense of order." Heidi did not ask where they were going or what he expected in return. She simply stood up and walked into the circle of his protection, feeling the sudden, overwhelming warmth of his presence. As they moved toward the glass doors of the private hangar, the men in the gray coats vanished into the shadows, knowing better than to challenge the sovereign of a shadow empire on his own ground. Silas did not touch her, but he walked close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a silent promise of safety that felt more like a threat of a different kind. They boarded the jet, a sleek machine of matte black and chrome that looked more like a weapon than a vehicle of transport. Inside, the cabin was a sanctuary of cream leather, polished mahogany, and the scent of aged whiskey and leather-bound books. As the engines began to whine, a low-pitched growl that signaled their departure from the world Heidi knew, she realized the lie she had told herself, that this was just a rescue, was falling away. Silas Vane did not rescue people. He collected things of value, and as he sat across from her in the pressurized silence of the cabin, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid, she realized she had just become the most precarious asset in a portfolio that spanned the globe. The ascent was a smooth, gravity-defying surge that left the lights of the airport far below, leaving Heidi and Silas in a cocoon of pressurized luxury that felt entirely disconnected from the reality of the ground. Heidi sat by the window, watching the clouds pass beneath them like ghosts in the moonlight, while Silas worked through a stack of documents with a silver fountain pen that moved with lethal precision. He moved with a terrifying efficiency, his focus absolute, yet she could feel his awareness of her presence like a physical touch against her skin. He was a man of dualities, the CEO who dictated the movement of millions of tons of cargo across the Atlantic, and the Don who decided which of those containers would never reach their destination if the price of loyalty was not paid in full. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was thick with the unsaid, a slow-burning tension that made the air feel heavy and charged with static. Heidi took a sip of the whiskey he had given her, the burn of it anchoring her to the reality of the situation, and she found herself trying to analyze the structure of the man across from her as if he were a building she was tasked with renovating. You are wondering if the price of the flight is higher than the debt you are running from, and if the man sitting across from you is merely a more sophisticated version of the thugs you left behind in the terminal, Silas said without looking up from his papers. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to sync with the vibration of the jet's engines, creating a harmony of power and control. Heidi turned away from the window, her blonde hair catching the soft glow of the cabin lights and framing her face in a halo of gold. "I was wondering why a man who has everything would bother with a woman who has nothing but a suitcase full of sketches and a father who doesn't know the meaning of the word enough," she countered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Silas finally looked up, setting the pen aside with a click that sounded like a hammer being cocked on a firearm. "You are wrong, Heidi. You do not have nothing. You have a name that carries a weight you clearly do not understand, and you have a mind that is currently trying to figure out how to escape a plane at 30,000 feet while still maintaining your dignity. That intelligence is a rare currency in my world, and it is far more valuable than the gold bars I keep in my vaults. My business is built on the movement of physical goods, but my empire is built on the movement of secrets and the people who can decode them. The revelation that he knew her name and the specifics of her situation sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. She had tried so hard to bury her identity, to be nothing more than a researcher with a love for Gothic revivalism and the quiet history of stone. But she had forgotten that men like Silas Vane did not leave things to chance or coincidence. He explained, with a chilling lack of emotion, that her father had not just gambled with money. He had gambled with information regarding a shipment of specialized microchips that Silas's corporate arm had been tracking for months. Her father had disappeared into the shadows of the underworld, leaving Heidi as the only person who might know where the encryption keys were hidden, keys that were supposedly disguised within her own architectural sketches of the old cathedral in London. "I am not a kidnapper," Silas continued, his eyes darkening to the color of a stormy sea. "You are free to leave when we land in Zurich. But the men at the airport were not the only ones looking for you, and they certainly won't be as polite as I have been. If you stay with me, you are protected by the Morty name and the full weight of Vane Industries. If you walk away, you are a target for every scavenger and lowlife from here to Moscow who thinks you are the map to fortune. It is not a choice I am forcing upon you, Heidi. It is an education in the reality of the world you have just inherited." As the hours passed and the jet streaked toward the heart of Europe, the boundary between the billionaire executive and the Mafia kingpin began to blur into a single, terrifying entity. A satellite phone rang, and Silas took the call in a language Heidi didn't recognize. Sharp, staccato sounds that felt like a series of commands designed to move mountains and end lives. His demeanor changed in an instant. The polished executive vanished, replaced by a man who looked like he could dismantle a human being with his bare hands and feel nothing but a mild sense of accomplishment. He spoke of territories, of retribution, and of a shipment that had been intercepted in the Mediterranean, his voice cold and devoid of any human warmth. When he hung up, his eyes were cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins, yet when he looked at her, there was a flicker of something else. A possessive, dark curiosity that made her heart skip a beat and her breath catch in her throat. He stood up and walked over to her, his large hand coming to rest on the headrest of her chair, pinning her in place with the sheer weight of his presence. "You are remarkably calm for a woman who has just learned her life is a forfeit in a game she didn't know she was playing," he whispered, his face inches from hers. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a touch that was unexpectedly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she knew he was capable of dispensing with a single word. "You will find that I am both the storm and the shelter, Heidi, and that the only way to survive is to decide which one you want to stand in," he said, his voice dropping to a rough growl. The temptation to lean into his touch was overwhelming, a biological betrayal of her common sense that left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. She saw the scars on his knuckles, the marks of a man who had fought his way out of the gutter of post-war Europe to sit on a throne of glass and blood, and she felt a strange, magnetic pull toward his darkness. It was a slow-burn attraction, fueled by the adrenaline of the night and the sheer magnetism of his power, and she realized that she was no longer just running from her father's past. She was running toward a future that was as dangerous as it was intoxicating. When the pilot announced their descent into Switzerland, the moment broke, but the tension remained, a living thing that followed them out of the plane and into the waiting armored limousine that was to take them to his fortress. The estate in Zurich was a fortress of glass and black stone, perched on a cliffside that overlooked the slate-gray waters of the lake like a silent guardian of the mountain. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, cold and imposing, much like the man who owned it, with clean lines that hid a labyrinth of security systems and reinforced steel. Heidi was given a suite of rooms that were larger than her entire apartment in London, filled with silk sheets, original Renaissance paintings, and a view of the Alps that was so beautiful it felt painful. But the luxury was a cage, nonetheless, a golden prison where every door was monitored and every window was bulletproof. Over the next week, the reality of Silas's world began to bleed into her own life with the slow, inevitable creep of a rising tide. She saw the way his staff moved, with a terrified reverence that bordered on worship, and she saw the way he controlled the flow of information across 3 continents from a mahogany desk that looked like a field of battle. He was a man of immense responsibility, carrying the weight of thousands of lives on his shoulders, both in the legitimate boardrooms of Vane Industries and in the clandestine meetings of the Morty Syndicate, where the true law was written. One evening, as the snow began to fall outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the world into a blur of white and gray, Silas found Heidi in the library. She was buried in a rare manuscript about the construction of the Milan Cathedral, her fingers tracing the intricate drawings of flying buttresses and vaulted ceilings. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes deeper than usual, and he had discarded his jacket and tie, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the edge of a tattoo that looked like a serpent coiled around a dagger. He sat across from her, and for the first time, he spoke of the path that had led him to this life. He told her of a childhood spent in the shadows of World War II ruins in Italy, of a family that had been decimated by betrayal and a brother who had been the true heir to the Morty name, but had been executed in a drive-by shooting, leaving Silas to pick up the pieces of a fractured empire before he was even 20 years old. He spoke of the blood he had spilled to keep his sisters safe, and the lies he had to tell the world to keep his corporate interests legitimate. "I did not choose this life, Heidi," he said, his voice heavy with a weariness she hadn't expected to hear. "I was forged by it in the fires of necessity, and I have spent every day since then making sure I am the one holding the hammer." Heidi felt a wave of empathy for him, a dangerous emotion in a house built on secrets and blood. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers tracing the scars on his knuckles that told the story of 100 battles fought in the dark. "My father was not a good man, but he was a man who believed that the only way to be free was to owe no one anything," she admitted, her voice a soft whisper in the vast, silent library. "He spent his life trying to be invisible, and he ended up disappearing entirely, leaving me to pay the price for his freedom. I spent my life trying to be invisible too, thinking that if I just studied the past, the present wouldn't be able to find me. But being here, with you, I realized that invisibility is just another kind of prison. You are paying for your power with your solitude, and I am paying for my safety with my soul." Silas gripped her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture of profound intimacy that felt more significant than any kiss or whispered promise. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch, a raw vulnerability showing through the cracks of his armor for the briefest of moments. The moment was shattered by the arrival of one of his lieutenants, a man named Marco who looked like he had been born with a scowl and a weapon in his hand. There was a problem at the docks in Marseille. A rival faction, the Greco family, had intercepted a shipment of medical supplies intended for a charity Silas supported, but they were also demanding the encryption keys that Heidi's father had supposedly stolen. They knew she was with Silas, and they had sent a message to prove they were serious. A severed finger of one of Silas's most trusted couriers, delivered in a box of expensive chocolates. The brutality of it hit Heidi like a physical blow, the reality of the Mafia war crashing through the ivory tower of the estate and leaving her gasping for air. Silas's eyes turned to flint in an instant, the vulnerability vanishing as if it had never existed. He didn't comfort her. He stood up and began barking orders in a voice that was cold and commanding, his mind already 3 steps ahead in a game of lethal chess. "You will stay in this room, and you will not leave it for any reason," he told her, his voice a razor blade of authority. "My men will be at the door, and they are authorized to use any means necessary to ensure your safety. The Greco family has made a mistake by thinking you are a weakness I can be exploited through. I am going to show them that you are the reason I am going to destroy them." Heidi watched him leave, the man she had just felt a connection with replaced by the warlord she had first seen in the airport. She realized then that her past was not just a memory or a debt. It was a ghost that had followed her into Silas's arms, and it was now threatening to burn his entire world down to the ground. She sat in the dark library, the silence of the estate feeling more like a tomb than ever before, listening to the sound of black SUVs arriving in the courtyard and the sharp, metallic clicks of weapons being readied for war. She knew that the price of his protection was her soul, and as the snow continued to fall, burying the world in a shroud of white, she wondered if Silas Vane would be the one to save her from the darkness or the one to finally drag her into it. The slow burn romance was no longer a game of glances and intellectual sparring. It was a trial by fire, and the flames were rising higher than she could have ever imagined. The days that followed were a blur of high-stakes tension, whispered strategies, and the constant, underlying hum of a world at war. Silas was rarely seen, his time consumed by the mobilization of his forces across Europe and the constant management of his legitimate business interests, which were being targeted by the Greco family's corporate spies. The estate had become a command center, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder, expensive tobacco, and the ozone of high-end surveillance equipment. Heidi felt like a ghost haunting her own life, moving through the luxurious rooms while the world outside descended into a chaos she had caused simply by existing. She was no longer just a guest or a refugee. She was the catalyst for a conflict that was threatening to tear apart the delicate balance of power Silas had maintained for years through sheer force of will. Yet, in the rare moments when they were alone, the connection between them only deepened, becoming a desperate anchor in a sea of violence. Silas would come to her room in the dead of night, his clothes smelling of rain and iron, and he would simply hold her, his head resting against her shoulder as if she were the only thing keeping him from drifting away into the abyss. One night he brought her a necklace, a heavy piece of platinum set with a singular blood-red ruby that seemed to glow with an inner fire of its own. "It is not a gift for your beauty, though it pales in comparison to you," he said, his voice gravelly with exhaustion and the weight of the decisions he had made that day. "It is a promise and a weapon. My enemies think you are my weakness, Heidi. They think they can use you to break the Morty legacy and take everything I have built. But they do not understand that you are the only thing worth fighting for in a world that has given me nothing but scars. If anything happens to me, there is a microchip hidden in the setting of this stone. It contains enough evidence of money laundering, political corruption, and murder to dismantle the Greco family and half the government officials in this country. It is your insurance policy, and your way out if the darkness finally wins." Heidi looked at the ruby, its deep red color reminding her of the blood that was being shed in her name on the streets of Paris and Marseille. "I don't want an insurance policy, Silas. I want you to stop before there is nothing left of the man I am starting to love," she said, her voice cracking with the effort of holding back her tears. "I want the man who looked at architectural drawings with me to come back from the war." Silas pulled her into a kiss that was desperate and hungry, a collision of teeth and tongue that tasted of salt, sorrow, and the metallic tang of destiny. "I cannot stop, Heidi, because this world does not allow for exits or retirements for men like me," he whispered against her lips, his hands tangling in her long blonde hair. "It only allows for winners and losers, and I have spent my entire life making sure I am never the one on my knees." The price of their love became clear when the Greco family launched a daring, high-profile assault on a Vane Industries gala in Paris, a black tie event intended to celebrate a new technology partnership. Silas had insisted Heidi stay behind in the safety of the Zurich estate, but she had seen the look in his eyes, the look of a man who knew he was walking into an ambush and was doing it anyway to protect his reputation and his people. She had used her knowledge of the estate's security systems to slip out through a maintenance tunnel, following him in a car she had obtained through a mixture of desperation and the jewelry she had hidden in her bag. She arrived at the gala just as the first shots were fired, the sound of breaking glass and screaming socialites filling the air with the music of disaster. She saw Silas in the center of the fray, a silhouette of lethal grace as he returned fire with a suppressed pistol, his bodyguards falling around him like autumn leaves in a gale. She realized then that he was not just a boss or a CEO. He was a king defending his territory against the barbarians at the gate, and for the first time, he looked like he might actually lose. Heidi didn't think about the danger to herself. She acted on the instincts of a woman who had spent her life understanding the hidden paths of buildings. She knew the layout of the Parisian mansion, an old Napoleonic structure she had studied in her research, and she knew there was a service tunnel that led to the underground parking garage that didn't appear on modern blueprints. She managed to reach Silas through the smoke and chaos, her travel-worn jeans and fitted coat a stark contrast to the elegant evening gowns and tailored tuxedos of the other guests. "Silas!" she screamed over the roar of a submachine gun that was chewing up the marble columns of the ballroom. The service tunnel, behind the tapestries in the West Gallery. He looked at her, horror and fury warring on his face that she was there in the line of fire, but he saw the determination in her eyes and followed her. They scrambled through the dark, damp tunnel, the sounds of the battle fading above them as they descended into the bowels of the city. When they reached the garage, Silas was bleeding from a deep wound in his side, his face pale under the fluorescent lights, but his eyes burning with a dark, primal intensity that terrified and captivated her in equal measure. "You shouldn't have come. You should have stayed where it was safe," he rasped, leaning against a concrete pillar for support while he checked his weapon. Heidi gripped his hand, her own covered in his blood, and she felt the connection between them solidify into something unbreakable and eternal. "I told you at the airport, Silas, I am not invisible anymore, and I am certainly not going to let you die in a basement in Paris while I wait for a phone call that never comes. I am with you, for better or for worse, and if we are going to burn, we are going to burn together." In that moment, the power imbalance that had defined their relationship finally collapsed. He was no longer the untouchable titan of industry, and she was no longer the rescued waif. They were two people trapped in a nightmare of their own making, bound by a loyalty that transcended the violence of their world and a love that was forged in the heat of a literal fire. Silas looked at her, and she saw the promise he had made her reflected in the mercury gray of his eyes. He wasn't just going to protect her. He was going to change the world so that she would never have to run again. The final reckoning took place in a secluded villa on the outskirts of Rome, a place where the air smelled of lemon trees, ancient dust, and the impending storm of justice. The Greco family had been lured there under the guise of a peace summit, a final meeting to hand over the encryption keys and end the war that was costing both sides millions of dollars and dozens of lives. Silas stood at the head of a long oak table that had seen centuries of history, his hand resting on the hilt of a concealed blade, while Heidi stood by the window, her silhouette a reminder of the future he was fighting for. The head of the Greco family, a bloated, arrogant man named Antonio who smelled of cheap cigars and a lifetime of malice, laughed as he demanded the keys to the empire he thought he had already won. "You are soft, vain, you have allowed a woman to cloud your judgment and weaken your grip on the Morty legacy," Antonio sneered, gesturing toward Heidi with a contemptuous flick of his cigar. "You brought a lamb to a wolf's den, and now you are going to watch as we feast." Silas didn't move, his expression as calm and unreadable as a frozen lake in the middle of a mountain winter. "I brought a witness, Antonio, and I brought the architect of your destruction," Silas replied, his voice a low, lethal silk that seemed to chill the very air in the room. "I wanted her to see the exact moment the old world died, and the new one began." With a signal that was nothing more than a slight nod toward the security cameras, the villa was swarmed not by the Mafia's traditional soldiers, but by an elite tactical team of international law enforcement and Silas's own specialized security forces. But it wasn't a simple massacre or a gangland hit. It was a surgical extraction of the rot that had plagued the city for decades. Silas had spent the last week using his corporate resources to bypass the Mafia's traditional channels of influence, handing over years of meticulously gathered evidence of the Greco family's illegal dealings to the international authorities in exchange for a clean slate for the Morty legitimate holdings. He had chosen to use the law as a weapon of mass destruction, a move that the traditional Mafia families found unthinkable and impossible to counter. As the police sirens began to wail in the distance and the first flashbangs detonated in the courtyard, Silas turned to Antonio, who was now trembling with a realization of his own obsolescence. "I am no longer playing the game you were born into. I am a CEO, and I have just initiated a hostile takeover of your entire existence. By tomorrow morning, your assets will be liquidated, your men will be in high-security cells, and your name will be a footnote in a history book about the end of the era of the street thug." In the aftermath of the raid, as the sun began to rise over the Eternal City, the world felt fundamentally different to Heidi. The constant, gnawing threat of the Greco family was gone, and her father had been located in a safe house in Montenegro, given a choice by Silas between a quiet, well-funded retirement in a gilded cage or a permanent stay in an Italian prison for his past crimes. He had chosen the cage, and Heidi knew she would never have to look over her shoulder for him again. Silas sat with Heidi on the terrace of the villa, the sunrise painting the ancient ruins of Rome in shades of gold, violet, and a deep, hopeful orange. He looked older, the lines around his eyes more pronounced and the gray in his hair more visible in the morning light, but the coldness had finally left his gaze. "I am stepping down from the Morty Council and transferring the leadership to Marco, who has no desire for the legitimate world and is content to manage the remaining interests in the shadows," Silas told her, his voice steady and filled with a new kind of peace. I will remain the CEO of Vane Industries, but the shadow world. I am leaving it behind as much as a man like me can ever truly leave the past. I want to build things that last, Heidi, things that don't require a gun to defend. Heidi looked out over the rolling hills of Rome, feeling a sense of peace and belonging she hadn't known since she was a child. She knew that danger would always be a part of their lives. A man like Silas Vane did not simply walk away from a throne without a few ghosts following him and a few enemies waiting for a moment of weakness. But she also knew that they would face whatever came together, as equals. She turned to him, taking his large, scarred hand in hers and squeezing it with a strength that surprised them both. "You don't have to be a ghost or a king anymore, Silas," she said, her voice a soft promise of a future they both deserved. "You can just be a man who loves a woman and a man who builds a legacy out of something other than blood." Silas pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with a strength that was no longer possessive or fearful, but protective in the truest, most profound sense of the word. "I think I would like to try that," he whispered, his breath warm against her hair as the first full light of the day broke over the horizon. The ending was not a simple fairy tale. There were still legal battles to be fought, corporate structures to be dismantled, and a lifetime of habits to be unlearned. But as they stood together in the light of the new day, the slow-burn trust and obsession they had built had forged into something unbreakable and eternal. Heidi had found her structure, not in the cold stone of the past, but in the living, breathing strength of the man beside her. And Silas had found his redemption in the woman who had dared to walk into the dark with him and lead him back to the light. They were no longer the mafia boss and the stranded traveler. They were the architects of a new world. And for the first time in either of their lives, the future was not a debt to be paid in blood, but a promise to be kept in love.